What's up, everyone? Welcome to the first episode of the Chamber Music Society of Salt Lake City's Score Breakdown. We are going to be releasing one of these videos every week throughout the duration of the summer where we break down one movement of a piece from the standard repertoire, go into a little bit of its history, go into a little bit about the movement itself, and go into a little bit about what is actually required in order to put this movement together from the perspective of a string player. The first piece that we are going to be breaking apart is Fauré's Piano Quartet in C minor. I absolutely love this piece, so let's get straight in to the first movement. This movement is structured in sonata form. So what does sonata form actually mean? In sonata form, we start out with the statement of the first theme. This is the most recognizable theme of the movement. After that, we go into the introduction of the second theme, which is a theme that complements the first theme that we heard at the beginning, but takes the piece in a bit of a different direction. Followed by the second theme, we go into the development where the composer uses this particular section to play around with the first and second theme, to blend them, to change them in different ways that propels the piece forward. From here, we get to the recapitulation, which is the restatement of the first and second theme from the beginning of the piece, which is sometimes followed by a coda depending on the movement. So, I threw a lot of ideas at you. First, second theme, development, recapitulation. What does all of this actually sound like in the context of Fauré's Piano Quartet? Let's take a look at each of these sections described. Pretty incredible writing, right? Even with just these small sections at the beginning of each of the elements of sonata form, we see a really fabulous composer coming into his prime. When Fauré wrote this, I believe he was 30, 31, something like that. Not very old, and this was one of his first forays, no pun intended, into the chamber music instrumentation with his composition. Before we go any farther, click on the like button below. Be sure to subscribe to our page to get further updates for the coming movements and coming pieces that we are going to be talking about and discussing over the course of the summer. And furthermore, if there's a particular piece that you would like to have me pull apart over the course of the coming months, leave it in the comments below. Now, back to Fauré Piano Quartet in C minor. So let's take a look at some of the elements inside of the first theme, just starting right at the beginning of the piece. So we see this element at the beginning, ba 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 ba, with this dotted rhythm. Because if you think about it, Fauré didn't really have to add in that dum bum bum ba bum ba bum. He could have done bum 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 and just done something like straight quarter notes, but it wouldn't have had that really intense friction, this need to move forward through the piece. And he further complicates what's going on with what we see in the piano part. If you take a look, we have these eighth note chords in both the right and the left hand. However, the chords are not on the downbeat, they are on the offbeat of each beat inside of the measure. And again, this provides a sort of friction moving forward that pushes us through the beginning of the piece in a way that I think is much stronger than had he put these chords on the downbeat. Now, Fauré does something really interesting at measure 6. I think a lesser composer would start a piece like this in forte and continue throughout the duration of the first theme, keeping the same general dynamic. Somewhere around forte, maybe some mezzo forte, maybe even some mezzo piano, but Fauré, being the genius that he is, throws us a curveball by giving us a pianissimo inside of the first 6 bars of music. Now, as a string player, at the beginning, we would probably do something along the lines of playing right in the center of our sounding point to get a really robust sound, like so. Something right in the center to get something really grounded and really, again, just to use the word for a second time, robust. However, in measure 6, as a string player, we can do something really interesting to change up the kind of sound that we're looking to get. Instead of playing right in the center of the sounding point, we can move our bow a little bit closer to the black fingerboard, which gives us an interesting effect. Check it out. At which point the crescendo starts to come into the music, and then we start moving things a little bit closer to where we would regularly play the instrument right here. So already our musical palette within the first couple of bars of this fabulous movement is huge. It's French in its scope of vision. From here, if we jump forward to measure 38, we finally get to the second theme of the movement. And that theme is passed around from viola to first violin to cello, keeping it in cello for a while, then finally developed inside of the piano a few bars later. And again, the way that Fauré actually uses this is in direct contrast to what he was doing at the beginning. We had unison in the first violin, the viola, and the cello. Here, we have almost a call and response, borderline canon figure, where the main melody inside of the second theme hops from voice to voice and sort of cascades on top of itself to measure 48, where all of a sudden we then start to incorporate some of the unison features that we saw at the beginning of the movement here in the music to take us to what is kind of the climax of the second theme. The end of this theme takes us all the way to measure 62, where we finally get back to some of the material that we see from the beginning of the piece in a very specific rhythmic manner. Bum, 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 bum. However, this time we're back in pianissimo, though to me this pianissimo is different in terms of the kind of sound world that it's trying to open up, as opposed to what we heard in, let's say, measure 6. Here, as a performer, I wouldn't do something as extreme as what I would do in measure 6. For example, I wouldn't go super far over to the fingerboard to get that almost alto flute sound. This, to me, is a little bit more direct, considering where it's going. See if you can hear what I mean in this clip, and take a listen to where the clip starts musically and where it ends. You see what I mean? Had we started with that alto flute sound like we did at measure 6, it would have been too big of a gap to try and traverse in terms of the kind of sound world that we were creating. So now, this takes us to measure 74, which is the beginning of the development section. This is a really fun development section because Fauré takes the original material that we heard in the first theme and second theme and does a lot of really cool, crazy stuff with it. Instead of starting us off in a really heavy, minor, turmoil-ridden key, we start in E flat major with the same motive that we heard at the beginning, da-dum, ba-bum, ba-ba-bum, but in a completely different setting. And then we get this nice triplet figure inside of measure 77. And then in measure 81, the first violin takes over this major version of the first theme. And then in measure 87, something interesting happens. He takes the dum, ba-bum, ba-ba-bum, ba-bum, bum-bum from the first theme. However, instead of putting it in unison or putting it by itself in a single instrument, he starts to use the canonic device that we saw in the second theme by allowing the dum, ba-bum, bum-bum to pass from instrument to instrument, almost cascading on top of itself to create something larger than where we originally started. Take a listen to this. First, we see it in the right hand of measure 87 in the piano, and then in measure 88 in the cello, 89 in the viola, right hand piano in measure 90, back to cello, back to viola, and then to the first violin in measure 93. It feels like we're going somewhere here, but if we listen for a few bars, take a listen to what happens musically. Do we hear a climax like we're expecting, or does the music go in a different direction? Very different than we were probably expecting when we first started that clip. And then things keep going and going and going until we get to measure 116, at which point we have finally entered the world of the second theme. We see this inside of the first violin, passed on to the viola and further developed on top of some of the material we find from the first theme inside of the cello in measure 118. Take a listen to what I'm referring to here. Second theme in the first violin, passed on to the viola, followed by the cello with material from the first theme. And different variations of this interplay continue all the way through measure 148, at which point Fauré is getting to the end of the development and he's going to take us to this part of the piece with a lot of what you would call pizzazz. We start at the end of 148 in the cello and the left hand of the piano with the original rhythmic motive, bum, ba-bum, ba-ba-bum, ba-bum. And here he starts to bet the house on the musical idea of cascading these things on top of one another in order to take us to what will end up being the emotional climax of the piece thus far. Starting in the left hand of the piano and the cello in measure 148, joined by the viola in 149, and the violin in 150, and again in the piano in the same measure. And throughout this section we build and we build until we get running 30-second notes, which we've never heard before up until this point. And with these 30-second notes, he brings us back to the beginning. We have reached the recapitulation, and again, the recapitulation is really just the restatement of the first and second theme. However, the question arises, why would we want to cover material that we've already heard? Think of it this way. If you were to hear a piece of music where the first section was wholly unique and the second section was wholly unique, as was the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth, and seventh, and eighth, and ninth section into infinity, where you never heard any of the material repeat for a second time, would there be any sort of oral narrative that you would be able to latch onto in order to make sense of the piece? I would argue no, because this sense of formatting, this sense of form in musical composition can be found in every style of narrative art. In films, we start off a movie with certain themes that we then revisit again at the end. In pop music, we have verse, chorus, repeating familiar material so that the ear isn't overwhelmed with new ideas and left to its own devices to try and make sense of what's going on. This is what Fauré is using when he utilizes sonata form. He's creating ideas within a structure that has historically been handed to him for the purpose of getting his musical message across in an even more concise and, I would say, deeply meaningful way. As human beings, we latch on to things that narratively make sense through repetition. Once our ear becomes accustomed to something, we are able to understand it at a deeper level in the event that the composer is well skilled in his craft to begin with, which, as we've already discovered, Fauré more than fits the bill. Now, much of this recapitulation is incredibly similar to what happens at the beginning of the movement. So let's jump to the end so that we can really see how Fauré chooses to close off this masterwork of a first movement. As we go through, you're noticing the piano is again on the offbeat. The cello joins in with the descending bass line. And in measure 242, we land with a chorale in the strings. And finally, the movement comes to a close. So there are some wonderful things going on in this movement, and my breakdown of this won't do it full justice because we haven't listened to the entire piece. Below in the description, I have included a couple of recordings that I highly recommend you check out between now and next week's episode, where we are going to break apart the second movement of the Fauré Piano Quartet in C minor. The more familiar you are with this first movement, the more the second, the third, and the fourth movement are going to make sense. So really be sure to check out these recordings so that when we enter the conversation in next week's movement, you are further illuminated and thus further prepared to start pulling it apart. So with that, we will see you at our scheduled time next week, Wednesday at 12 p.m. Mountain Standard. We'll see you then.